There are autumn mornings in Chicago so cold that every breath feels like a blade, cutting into the throats of people quietly walking down the fog-dusted sidewalks. And in that cold, a young black man in a faded grey hoodie stands silently in front of the heavy wooden doors of the mathematics building, gripping the strap of his backpack, taking a deep breath, and pushing the door open. His name is Miles Carter, 19 years old, a freshman, and the only black student in the notoriously tough advanced mathematics class at the University of Chicago, where judgmental stares seem to slip into every breath you take. The hallway glows cold under fluorescent lights, the click of high heels echoing sharply on the tile floor, announcing the arrival of Professor Holland, a woman with her hair tied up neatly, silver-rimmed glasses, and eyes like thin blades, ready to cut into the pride of any student daring enough to look her in the eye. That day, Holland stepped into the classroom, tapped the chalk against the board, her gaze sweeping over each student. For a moment, her eyes stopped on Miles, long enough for him to feel a cold slash through the air. And as her gaze moved on, whispers, light as wind, began to ripple through the classroom. How good does he think he is? This place isn't for someone like him. Miles heard it all. He heard it with a heart that had grown used to being judged because of the color of his skin, because of a worn-out hoodie and cheap shoes. But he didn't look up. He only pressed his lips together, his eyes following the numbers on the board as if they were the only thread keeping him connected to this world. Because math didn't care who he was. It didn't care if he was rich or poor, what color his skin was, or what his family did. Numbers held only one truth, right or wrong. As Holland turned around to write a long string of formulas on the board, numbers lining up like a maze with no exit, Miles gripped his pen so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded not from fear of the numbers, but from the fear of failing in front of those waiting to see him fail. In a class of over 80 students, Miles felt like a stain of black ink on white paper. Every doubtful glance was a small cut, making him bleed in silence. But he stayed there, watching the board, breathing deeply, pushing every sneer and whisper out of his mind, leaving only the dancing numbers behind. That day, no one knew that this class would mark the beginning of a chain of events that would shake the entire mathematics department. No one knew that this quiet young black man, with determined eyes and calloused hands, would step up to the front, facing Holland and the prejudice she represented. Miles didn't know what the future would hold. He only knew that if he didn't stand up today, if he didn't prove his worth today, he might never get another chance to break the invisible wall holding him back. And at the moment when the piece of white chalk slipped from Holland's hand and rolled across the floor, leaving a faint trail of dust, Miles took a deep breath and raised his hand. The air froze. The entire class fell silent. Professor Holland turned around, raising an eyebrow, her gaze cold as steel. "Is there a problem?" Carter Miles tightened his grip on the strap of his backpack by his feet, lifted his head, and looked into Holland's eyes for the first time. there's a mistake in your solution. And in that exact moment, destiny began to shift. The breath of the entire class paused as Miles spoke those words. He could feel every gaze drilling into his skin, every heartbeat pounding as if it might explode in his chest. Holland stood still, her eyes icy, her face expressionless, but the corner of her mouth twitched into a thin smile, as if she had just heard a weak joke. "What did you just say?" Her voice was calm, not loud, but it echoed across the room. Miles swallowed, his throat dry, but he didn't look away from Holland. "Your solution. There's a step wrong in the transformation." His voice trembled slightly, but it was clear. A quiet ripple of laughter rose from the back rows. A few students near the door shook their heads, whispering, "Is he crazy?" Calling out Holland. "He's going to get crushed." Holland began walking back to the board, her steps slow, each heel click echoing like a judge's gavel. She picked up the chalk, glanced at the equation on the board, then looked at Miles. Then, "Show me where it's wrong." She extended the chalk toward Miles, her eyes sharp, a clear challenge. The room was silent. Some faces showed surprise, some showed the delight of expecting a public humiliation. Miles stood up, his legs trembling slightly, but he took a deep breath and walked toward the board. The distance from his seat to the blackboard felt longer than any road he had ever walked. He took the chalk, feeling its cold bite into his fingertips. Before him were lines of complex equations, thick with mathematical symbols, a maze where one wrong step would collapse everything. But in that moment, everything around Miles faded, leaving only the numbers shining clear. Each transformation, each logical step illuminating like light in the darkness. Here, Miles circled a part of the solution, his voice low but firm. "This Laplace transformation is in the wrong position. If left as is, the final result will be off." Holland squinted, looking carefully at the spot Miles circled. 1 second, 2, 3. The silence in the room was absolute. Then she turned to Miles, her eyes narrowing, her voice cold. "Are you sure?" Miles nodded, his hands still shaking, but his voice calm in a strange way. "I'm certain." A rustle came from the back of the class as a student flipped through his notebook, double-checking the formulas. Another student looked up at the board, then at Miles, their eyes slowly changing. Holland stood still, then turned sharply, walking back to her desk, folding her arms across her chest, saying, "If you're so confident, come here and correct it." The air broke into whispers. A student with glasses whispered to his friend, "He's going to get humiliated. Holland doesn't get caught in mistakes." Miles tightened his grip on the chalk, took a deep breath, and nodded. He began rewriting from the incorrect transformation step, explaining each step clearly, every multiplication, every rearrangement, his voice steadying as he spoke. The soft scrape of chalk against the board blended with the pounding of his heart. Below, the stairs began to change, Faces that once looked down on him now silently watched. When Miles finally set the chalk down and stepped back, looking at the board with calm eyes, the class was silent. Holland walked up, her eyes fixed on the numbers. 1 minute, 2. She nodded slightly, her voice low and dry. Correct. Just one word. But for Miles, it was like a cool rain washing over years of enduring contemptuous stares. He walked back to his seat, his legs still trembling, but a small smile crept across his lips. That day, when the bell rang to dismiss class, no one said a word. But as Miles stood to leave, a white student sitting behind him gave him a small nod, eyes no longer filled with contempt. Miles stepped into the hallway, taking a deep breath of the cold midday air, looking at Chicago's grey sky. But to him, it no longer felt as heavy as it had that morning. The next day, Miles arrived at school earlier than usual. He walked into the lecture hall, his old sneakers softly scuffing against the cold tiles, echoing in the quiet space. Holland was still there at the podium, her face unreadable, but when her eyes passed over Miles, they paused for a moment, long enough for both to know that things had shifted, if only a little. As students began to file in, a few glanced at Miles, their looks no longer filled with scorn, but with curiosity, maybe even caution. They had seen him stand up, correct the strictest professor in the math department, and more importantly, he had been right. That day's class began with a problem even more complex than the day before. Holland turned around, writing lines of formulas long as a symphony, with peaks and intricate waves, then set the chalk down and looked back at the class. Who will solve this silence? Heads bowed, avoiding her eyes. A few quick glances flickered toward Miles, then back down. Miles could feel his heart pounding, sweat beading on his hand as he gripped his pen. A voice inside him spoke, "If not me, then who?" He took a deep breath and raised his hand once more. Holland raised an eyebrow, a thin smile flickering on her lips. Impossible to tell if it was mocking or amused Carter. Again, Miles stood up, walking toward the board. This time, the chalk in his hand didn't feel as cold as the day before, but he could still feel the tremble in his fingers. Holland folded her arms, tilting her head, her eyes like a hawk watching for a single mistake. Miles looked at the problem, the lines of equations like a maze, but in his eyes he saw logic, a path, a way out. The first step. We need to transform the Laplace function, but we can simplify before separating the variables. Miles began to explain, his voice trembling at first, but growing steady, clear, and firm with each word. A few students began to look up, following along, their hands moving faster over their notes, scribbling down the steps Miles was demonstrating. A brown-haired student in the front row leaned toward her friend and whispered, "He explains it even clearer than Holland." Holland glanced over at that student, her eyes sharpening before turning back to the board, narrowing not out of anger, but because she knew Miles was on the right track. As Miles reached the final step, placing the chalk down and turning around, there was a steady light in his eyes. Holland stepped forward, scanning the board, her hand moving down the lines of numbers, step by step. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Then she nodded, said nothing, just tapped the chalk lightly against the desk and turned back to the class. Write it down. The class froze for a moment. Then the rustling of notebooks, the scratching of pens against paper filled the room. Miles stepped back to his seat, his heart still pounding, but a faint smile crossed his lips. He sat down, his hands still slightly trembling, but the shaking was no longer fear. It was happiness. When the class ended, as Holland gathered her things, her gaze paused on Miles for a brief moment, and then she gave a slight nod, so subtle that no one else saw it. But Miles did, and in that look, for the first time, there was no contempt, but a silent acknowledgement. Miles stepped into the hallway, the cold morning air rushing against his face. But today, he held his head higher. Another black student standing near the door looked at him, eyes shimmering, and softly said, "Good job, man." Miles paused, turned, and gave a gentle smile back, replying, "Thank you." In that moment, he knew that every time he stood up, every time he raised his hand against prejudice, he wasn't just fighting for himself, but for all those who were being misjudged out there. 3 days later, the lecture hall echoed once more with the sharp, cold taps of Holland's heels as she walked into the room, each step pounding like the heartbeat of the nervous students bowing their heads. That day, the air was tenser than usual. Holland set her bag on the desk, pulled out a thick stack of papers, tapping it lightly against the desk as her gaze swept across the room, stopping on Miles, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Before we start today's lesson, there will be a short test." Her voice was calm, but cold. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room, a few students glancing at each other. A blonde kid in the back whispered, "This is definitely because of him," his eyes flicking over to Miles. Holland turned and began writing on the board, a long, complex problem filling the blackboard with dense symbols, nested integrals, higher-order derivatives, non-linear differential equations. The fluorescent lights reflected off the lines of numbers, glinting in the silver rims of Holland's glasses, making her eyes flash. "The national math competition will take place in a month," Holland said, her hand still writing, her voice clear and ringing through the room. "This problem is taken from last year's exam, the same one where students from MIT, Princeton, and Stanford struggled for hours." She paused, set the chalk down, and turned, her eyes locking on Miles. "If Carter is truly as capable as he seems—" Her voice dropped, but it was loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Show me, and show everyone here." Silence gripped the room. A female student leaned toward her friend, whispering, "She's testing him," in front of everyone. Miles felt his heart slam in his chest, the veins in his temples pulsing, a cold bead of sweat sliding down his spine. Holland's eyes didn't leave him, no longer filled with simple mockery, but with a direct, public challenge. Every eye in the room turned to Miles. Some held expectation, some doubt. and some silently hoping he would fail and return to being invisible. Miles tightened his grip on the backpack strap under his desk, feeling the cold sweat in his palms. He looked up at the board, the tangled lines of numbers like a labyrinth. In that moment, he saw the image of his mother again, the hard-working black woman at the hospital, her hands cracked, her eyes always gentle as she looked at him. Miles, no one has the right to tell you that you don't belong anywhere unless you give up. He took a deep breath, stood up, and walked toward the board. Each step felt like a mile, every eye following him, whispers halting. The only sounds left were his footsteps and the thundering of his heartbeat. Holland folded her arms, tilting her head as she watched him. "Are you ready?" Miles didn't answer. He picked up the chalk, staring at the board for a long moment. The symbols twisted like snakes, ready to swallow anyone who wasn't brave enough. But in his eyes, there was no fear left, only complete focus. "The first step," Miles said softly, then began to write. He broke the problem into smaller parts, separated the variables, changed variables, each line of numbers appearing clearly, the chalk strokes steady, firm, and precise. He moved slowly through the first steps, double-checking each transformation to ensure not even the smallest mistake. Below him, no one spoke, only the rustling of notebooks, the scratching of pens, and eyes that began to change. A student whispered, He really understands this." But Holland remained standing there, her eyes never leaving Miles's calculations. Her face stayed cold, but her hand tightened around the piece of chalk she held, her knuckles turning white. Miles could sense it, but he didn't care. For him, the whispers, the doubtful stares, the prejudice of others, all disappeared when he stood at the board, letting math speak for him. At the final step, he paused, took a breath, looked at the board, and then set the chalk down. The solution was complete, clean, without a single crossed-out line. The class was silent. Holland stepped forward, each step heavy, her eyes moving down the solution. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Then she set the chalk down, turned to the class, her voice rougher than usual. "Write it down." A wave of murmurs erupted, eyes wide with shock, pens rushing across pages. A student in the back looked up at Miles, slowly nodding, eyes glinting with respect. Miles turned, and for a brief moment, his eyes met Holland's. In that instant, Miles saw something he had never seen in her eyes before acknowledgement. He walked back to his seat, his heart still racing, but with each beat there was no fear left, only the certainty that he belonged here. That class ended, but the air in the room did not clear immediately. As students packed their notebooks, Holland stood at the lectern, her hand resting on the thick stack of papers, her gaze thoughtful as she looked out the window where the late autumn sunlight angled through the trees. Miles stood, sliding his backpack over his shoulder, about to leave when Holland's voice rang out, not loud, but enough to make the entire class pause. "Carter." Miles froze, turning to look at her. The entire class held its breath, watching. Holland turned, her eyes no longer cold as usual, but carrying a new light, a look of challenge, mixed with something no one could quite name. "You think just standing at the board, solving a few problems, is enough to prove you deserve to be here?" A new wave of murmurs rippled through the room, eyes shifting back to Miles, waiting to see how he would respond. Miles lightly tightened his grip on his backpack strap, his eyes unwavering, his voice low. "I don't need to prove it to anyone, only to myself." Holland's lips curled into a faint, dry smile. "Nice words, Carter. But if you want to prove yourself, do it where even the best in the country hesitate." She pulled a sheet from the stack, holding it up, her voice clear. "This is a notice for the National Math Competition, happening in a month. Students from MIT, Princeton, Stanford. True prodigies will be there. Last year, our school didn't even have anyone break into the top 10. She lowered the paper, looking straight at Miles. "If you truly are as good as you appear to be, if you want to prove to everyone that you're not just a lucky black kid who happens to be here, then sign up." The air froze. All eyes turned to Miles, wide with shock. Some laughed lightly, some shook their heads. A voice from the back whispered, "She's challenging him, in front of everyone. Does he even dare to accept?" Miles's heart pounded, the sounds around him crashing in his ears, mixing with his quickening breath. He remembered the night before, his mother sitting in their small kitchen, the warm yellow light casting shadows across her face, lined with the marks of hard work, her hand holding his tightly. "You don't need to prove your worth to anyone, Miles. But if you want to, prove it by living true to your talent." Miles took a deep breath, his eyes locking firmly with Holland's. "All right." His voice was low, clear. "I'll do it." A wave of whispers broke out. Some students exchanged looks. A girl whispered softly, "He's really going to do it." Holland narrowed her eyes slightly, watching him for a few seconds before giving a slight nod, as if she had expected his answer, but there was a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "Very well." Holland turned back to her desk, placing the paper down. "I'll send you the details and the study materials. I hope you won't disappoint me." She turned away, saying nothing more, but Miles saw her shoulders stiffen briefly, her hand clenching the paper for a moment before letting it go. As the students filed out of the classroom, many eyes passed over Miles, some surprised, some envious, some curious. A shorter black student passing by paused, looked at him, and said quietly, "Anyway, thanks." "Man." Miles looked surprised, but the student had already turned away. He stood still in the hallway, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The promise he made today would change everything. He knew he would have to face the best minds in America, prodigies groomed from childhood, armed with tutors, resources, private coaching, coming from wealthy families and prestigious schools. And him just a freshman, the son of a night shift nurse, living in a modest neighborhood, armed only with a pen and an old laptop. But today, he chose not to step back. Miles tightened his grip on his backpack strap and walked out of the lecture hall. The Chicago sky was overcast, wind sweeping through the streets, but he held his head high as a storm brewed inside him. If I want to change the way they see me, I have to do what no one believes I can. From that day on, Miles began a journey he knew would be lonely and brutal. Early in the mornings, when Chicago's buildings were still draped in cold mist, Miles was already at the library. The dim yellow light fell across his dog-eared notebook, pages filled with tangled formulas, messy handwriting showing the wear of exhaustion. At night, when his roommates were asleep, Miles would still be at his small desk by the window, the old laptop heating up under the glow of the desk lamp. He would type formulas, sketch graphs, and tackle problems pulled from international math competitions, questions that had broken some of the most talented students in America. There were nights he collapsed over his desk, breathing hard, his hand still gripping the pen. In those dreams, he heard Holland's voice again. If you want to prove it where even the best are afraid. And in those dreams, he saw his mother's eyes, gentle yet firm. You don't need to prove yourself to anyone. But if you choose to, don't give up. Miles would jolt awake, sweat soaking the back of his shirt, his heart racing, but he would wipe his face, open his notebook, and keep writing. During those days, Miles nearly cut himself off from the world around him. Friends would ask him to play basketball, and he would shake his head. They invited him out to eat, and he would smile, decline, pull out a cheap granola bar from his pocket, eat quickly, and return to his table. One afternoon, as the last rays of sunlight angled through the library windows, falling across pages thick with formulas, Brian, the only other black student in the class, placed a hand on Miles's shoulder and said softly, "You're turning yourself into a machine." Miles looked up, dark circles under his eyes, but his gaze burned bright. "I can't lose to them, Brian." Brian looked at him, silent, then sat down beside him without another word. For a moment, they sat together in silence. The only sounds were the rustle of turning pages, pens scratching paper, and the ticking of the clock counting down the seconds before the exam. There were days when Miles was exhausted. He would look at problems that were too hard, formulas that spanned pages, non-linear differential equations that made his head pound. He would clutch his head, his hands trembling, the pen slipping from his grasp, falling to the floor, rolling under the desk. Did I really think I could do this? I'm just a black kid with an old laptop, thinking I can beat MIT prodigies. In that moment, tears fell onto his notebook, soaking into the numbers, blurring them away. But then he would remember his mother's eyes, remember the mocking laughter in the classroom, remember Holland's small nod when he solved that impossible problem in front of everyone. Miles would pick up his pen, wipe his tears, and whisper to himself, "I didn't come this far just to quit." He learned to work faster, more precisely. Every morning, he would set a timer, forcing himself to solve complex problems in shorter time frames each day. He read reference books from the library, learned to approach problems from 3 different angles, finding the shortest, smartest path. Late at night, when he shut down his laptop and stood by the window, the lights of Chicago shimmering under the night sky, Miles clenched his fists, his breath heavy, but his eyes unyielding. "I'm going to show them that talent has no color." One late evening, as Holland walked through the library to collect some materials, she happened to see Miles sitting alone, the desk lamp casting warm light over his noticeably thinner face, but his eyes still bright, his hand steadily writing down formulas. She paused for a moment, her hand gently gripping the strap of her bag. In that moment, she saw herself from many years ago when she, too, had fought alone against formulas, skeptical eyes, and prejudice to claim her place in the harsh world of mathematics. Holland let out a quiet sigh, her eyes softening, before she turned away, leaving Miles alone with his world of numbers. Miles had come too far to turn back now, and he knew the real battle was about to begin. On the morning of the exam, Chicago was colder than usual. Wind swept through the long streets, blowing fallen yellow leaves against the bus windows where Miles sat, his hands gripping the backpack on his lap. He stared out the window, his breath fogging up the glass. Inside his backpack, next to his notebook filled with formulas, was a small photo of his mother, her gentle smile, her warm eyes, who had been with him through every lonely night. The bus stopped in front of the University of Chicago, the venue for the national competition. Hundreds of students stepped off, bundled in warm jackets, carrying backpacks branded with the logos of elite schools MIT, Princeton, Stanford, Harvard. Their cold, confident eyes, their proud strides the walk of prodigies who had dominated international math competitions. Miles stood among them, wearing his faded grey hoodie, carrying his worn-out backpack, shoes with peeling soles, but his eyes were bright and determined. The exam room was vast, lit by the cold glow of white lights. Rows of seats stretched across the room, each desk spaced apart, each student in their own world. Miles sat down, placed his backpack beside him, pulled out his pen, and took a deep breath. His heart pounded, each beat echoing in his ears. "I'm here now. There's no turning back." A voice came over the loudspeaker. "Welcome to the finalists of the National Math Competition." The room fell silent, the only sound the rustle of paper as the tests were distributed to each desk. Miles lowered his gaze, his hands trembling slightly as he placed the exam paper before him. Numbers, symbols, formulas densely packed across the pages. His eyes scanned each line, recognizing the terrifying difficulty of every question. In the distance, an MIT student, tall, blonde, with a calm face, began writing the moment he received the test. Others around him bent over their papers. The sound of pens moving steadily filled the room. Miles took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them and picked up his pen. The first question. Miles began analyzing each variable, each function, his hand writing quickly, each formula appearing neatly, clearly. One problem, two problems, three problems. His speed increased, as if these complex problems were the very same ones he had eaten and slept with for the past month. At the back of the room, Holland stood with the panel of judges, her eyes fixed on him, unblinking, beside her. A professor from Princeton asked quietly, "Who is that black kid?" Holland didn't turn, her voice low but clear. "A freshman." The professor raised his eyebrows, his eyes widening as he watched the speed of Miles's writing. An hour passed. Many students had put down their pens, wiping sweat from their brows, flipping through the test, their eyes filled with worry and exhaustion. Miles kept writing, each line firm and confident, with no corrections or cross-outs. Sweat beaded on his temples, rolling down his cheek, dropping onto the paper, spreading. But he did not stop. A Princeton student nearby looked up, his eyes filled with shock as he watched Miles solving a problem he himself had given up on. The final question, an extremely difficult nonlinear differential equation, layered transformations, functions hidden within functions, a true labyrinth. Miles paused for a second, lifting his gaze, looking across the wide room, seeing tense faces, trembling fingers, eyes darting around in desperation. He lowered his eyes, tightening his grip on the pen. "This is the moment I've been waiting for." Miles began to write, each step slow and deliberate, separating variables, changing variables, simplifying layer by layer through the complexity. Each second passed like the tick of a clock pounding against his chest. A bead of sweat dropped, soaking into the cuff of his old sleeve, mixing with the scent of paper, ink, and the metal smell of the old watch his mother gave him before the exam. Holland clenched her hands, her eyes never leaving Miles, feeling a strange mix inside her worry, but also a glimmer of hope. As Miles set down his pen, the clock on the wall gave a tick, signaling the final 5 minutes. He lifted his head, took a deep breath, exhaled, closed his eyes, and released the pen. The exam was done. The room still echoed with the frantic scratching of pens as other students rushed to finish. But for Miles, all sound disappeared, leaving only the calm beat of his heart. "I did everything I could." Holland looked at Miles, and in that moment her eyes softened. She knew he had fought a battle far bigger than any math problem, a battle against doubt, prejudice, and the fear of failure. When the final bell rang, Miles stood up and walked out of the exam room. Cold wind swept through the hallway, leaves rustling with each of his steps. He lifted his head to the grey Chicago sky, but in his eyes, a quiet fire burned. "I don't know what the result will be, but I fought with everything I had." 3 weeks after the exam, Chicago had entered its bitterly cold days, the season's first snow laying a thin layer across the red brick paths around the campus. Miles sat in the library, his notebook open before him, but his eyes stared blankly at the page, the numbers dancing and then fading, leaving a vast emptiness in his mind. They're going to announce the results today. His hand gripped his pen tightly, cold sweat breaking out in his palm even though the temperature outside was below freezing. Brian walked up, setting a hot coffee can down in front of him, his voice low. "Whatever happens, you did something no one else dared to do." Miles looked up at him, gave a tired smile, then nodded. "But I need to know if I'm worthy." The announcement crackled over the school's loudspeakers. The results of the national math competition have been posted on the mathematics department's bulletin board. A moment of silence. Then the library lobby exploded with noise as students rushed out. Footsteps pounding down the hall. Miles stood up, the coffee can still steaming on the table. He took a deep breath and walked forward. The hallway in front of the bulletin board was packed. Heads were crammed together, hands raised to snap photos of the results. Sighs of relief mixed with groans of disappointment. A student from MIT stood at the front, frowning, eyes filled with disappointment. A Princeton student backed away, covering his face, saying nothing. Miles pushed through the crowd, getting closer. His heart pounded in his chest. The top row on the board. Rank 1. Miles Carter, University of Chicago. Miles froze. The sounds around him seemed to vanish, leaving only the thunder of his heartbeat echoing in his chest. His breath quickened, his eyes blurred as he stared at the line. Rank 1. A voice behind him blurted out, "What? Who is that kid? No way. A freshman. He's black." Whispers rippled through the hallway, and the eyes around him turned toward Miles, filled with shock, astonishment, confusion, and admiration. Miles took a deep breath, looking up at the board, then closed his eyes. The cold slipped down the collar of his jacket and into his hair, but in his heart, a warm flame roared to life. I did it. At the end of the hallway, Holland stood leaning against the wall, arms folded, eyes fixed on him. When Miles's eyes met Holland's, there was a stillness. Holland gave a small nod, her eyes no longer skeptical, no longer cold, but shining with a quiet respect. Miles nodded back, eyes red, but a smile breaking across his face. Brian rushed over, slapping a hand on Miles's shoulder, his voice trembling with excitement. "You're number 1! Miles, you did it!" Miles turned, smiling, and for the first time, he laughed out loud, a light, relieved laugh. The laugh of someone who had not only won a competition, but had conquered the doubting stares and heavy prejudices that had weighed on his shoulders for so long. That afternoon, on the way home, Miles walked through the snow-covered streets, his breath turning into white mist. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from his mother. "You did it, didn't you?" Miles stopped, looked at the screen, then lifted his eyes to the grey-blue sky of Chicago, tears shimmering. He typed back, "Yes, Mom, I did it." That night, in the small dorm room, Miles opened his backpack, took out his notebook, flipping through the pages crammed with formulas, pages stained by tears, smudged by sweat. He gently smoothed the pages, closing his eyes. Talent has no color. No one gets to define your limits except you. Miles stood up, looking into the mirror. His face was thinner from sleepless nights, dark circles under his eyes, but his gaze was bright, calm, confident. Tomorrow, he would walk into Holland's class, sit in the same middle row, with the same old backpack. But this time, when he walked into that room, he knew every eye would look at him differently. No more doubt, No more disdain, no more mocking laughter, only acknowledgement. In a distant corner, Holland sat in her office, her silver-rimmed glasses reflecting the lamp's light. She looked at the results sheet once more, whispering softly, "You've shown us all that we were wrong." She folded the paper, lifted her head, her eyes softening, and for the first time in many years, she smiled when thinking of a student. Miles Carter. That name had crossed an invisible line, becoming a quiet symbol, inspiring those who had ever been misjudged, belittled, or laughed at because of their background, skin color, or circumstances. If I can do it, so can anyone. Miles set the notebook down, turned off the light, and gazed at the night sky through the window. A quiet night, and he knew this was only the beginning. Monday morning. The math department hallway was more crowded than usual. Students gathered in small groups, their eyes following Miles as he walked by, not with the cold, doubtful looks of before, but with curiosity, tinged with respect. That's Miles Carter. He won the national math competition. A freshman, black, unbelievable. The whispers filled the hallway, but today Miles walked with his shoulders back, his gaze calm, no longer lowered. Students sitting down sat up straighter, some glancing at him with a different look, a few offering small smiles and nods. Some who had once scoffed at him now turned away, avoiding his gaze. Miles sat down in his usual spot in the middle row, opened his old notebook, flipping to its frayed pages, waiting for Holland to enter. The door opened. The familiar click of high heels echoed. Holland walked in, holding a stack of papers, her face still stern, her sharp eyes under silver-rimmed glasses sweeping across the class. She paused for a moment when her eyes met Miles. In that instant, every eye in the room turned toward them. Holland set the stack on the desk, removed her glasses, and looked out over the class. Her voice low but clear. "Before we begin today's lesson, I have something to say." The air froze. Holland paused for a second, making sure everyone was listening. Then her eyes rested on Miles, her voice ringing out, steady and unflinching. "Miles Carter, our freshman, has taken first place in the national math competition." A wave of whispers erupted, faces turning in surprise, eyes flicking from Miles to Holland. Holland raised her hand for silence, then looked directly at Miles, her eyes deep, her voice slow, each word distinct. "I once thought that talent could not come from just anyone, from just anywhere. I was wrong. The room was so quiet you could hear breathing. Miles Carter has shown me, has shown the faculty, and has shown the students of this school one truth. Talent has no color. Talent is not defined by background or prejudice." She paused, taking a breath, her voice dropping, but her eyes no longer cold. And sometimes we need to look back at ourselves to see where we were wrong. The silence held. A clap came from the back of the room, then another, until the whole class was clapping. Miles sat there, lifting his head, looking at Holland. His eyes burned, but he didn't cry. He smiled, nodding softly. Holland put her glasses back on and turned away. But in that moment, the corners of her mouth lifted into a rare, gentle smile. That day, no one lost focus. No one snuck glances at their phones. As Holland wrote new formulas on the board, the class took careful notes, though many eyes still glanced over at Miles, where he sat, writing neatly, his pen strokes firm, his gaze focused. No one mocked him anymore. No one asked, "Do you really think you're good enough?" because he had answered them all with his own ability. During the lunch break, as Miles left the classroom, a group of freshmen approached him. A blonde white girl, holding a book, hesitated Carter. "Thank you." Miles blinked. "For what?" She smiled. "For proving that we can believe in ourselves, even when others tell us we're not good enough." A black boy behind her nodded. "What you did wasn't just for you. It gave hope to all of us." Miles paused, then smiled, nodding. "No one gets to tell us we don't belong here. No one." That afternoon, Miles sat alone in the library, the sunlight streaming through the window onto the pages. He flipped through his old notebook, pages dense with formulas, stained with tears and sweat from long nights hunched over his desk. I did it, but Miles knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. He lifted his eyes, looking out at the Chicago sky glowing with sunset, warm gold spilling over the snow-covered rooftops. It's time I help others, the way I helped myself. Miles slipped the notebook into his backpack, stood up, and walked out of the library, a soft smile on his face. It's time to stop being afraid. Since the day Holland publicly acknowledged Miles' ability in class, the atmosphere at the University of Chicago began to change. Students who had once sat silently in class, afraid to raise their hands in front of Holland, now began to ask questions they had once feared would be mocked. A few who had quietly asked Miles for help now began to sit beside him in the library, opening their books, asking him to explain difficult formulas. One Friday afternoon, as the sunset spilled through the library window onto the frayed pages, Miles closed his book and looked around. The seats around him were filled with freshmen, sophomores, black students and white students, those who had once felt inadequate, who had feared prejudice, now sitting together, debating a difficult math problem, eyes shining with confidence. Brian, sitting beside Miles, chuckled softly. "You know, Miles, you've changed this place." Miles turned, smiling gently. "It's not me." They changed because they dared to believe in themselves. That night, in the small dorm room, Miles opened his laptop and drafted an email to Holland. "Professor Holland, I would like to start a study group for students struggling with advanced math, especially those who lack confidence in their abilities. I'm willing to lead these sessions for free every weekend. I hope to have your approval. Miles Carter." He hit send, took a deep breath, closed his laptop, and looked out the window at the lights of Chicago sparkling under the night sky. The next morning, as Miles entered class, Holland called him over before he could sit down. She handed him a printed sheet, an official notice from the math department weekend study group, led by Miles Carter. Holland looked at him, her eyes no longer cold, but filled with trust. "You have 1 hour on Saturdays, in room 203. Don't disappoint me." Miles gripped the paper, his eyes lighting up. "Thank you." Holland nodded slightly, then turned to the lectern. But in that moment, he saw her shoulders relax, her eyes warmer when she looked at him. The first study group session. Room 203 was packed. Students from different departments came, some sitting quietly, eyes anxious, afraid of asking the wrong question, afraid of looking foolish. Miles stood at the board, holding a pen, smiling. "We're here to understand math together, not to prove who's better. Here, no one is looked down on." A female student raised her hand, her voice trembling. Professor Raymond smiled, shook Miles's hand, his voice warm. "I've heard a lot about you. I'm impressed." He handed Miles an envelope. "This is a full scholarship offer from Princeton. We would like you to join us, to be part of our applied mathematics research team for AI projects." The room was stunned. Brian's mouth fell open. Other students stared at Miles with admiration in their eyes. Miles looked at the envelope in his hands, his hand trembling slightly. Princeton, a dream he had never dared to believe in, was now real, right in front of him. That night, Miles sat alone in his dorm room. Outside the window, snow fell softly, streetlights casting a warm glow on his face. Miles held the letter, reading each word, each promise of a bright future, of doors opening wide. "We helped 5 more students understand math today." They raised their hands in Holland's class. A female student's voice, trembling with excitement. Miles nodded, his eyes burning. "That's amazing. Don't stop." After ending the call, Miles stepped out onto the balcony, lifting his head to the star-filled night sky. The cold wind swept through his hair, but he didn't feel cold anymore. It's time to write a new chapter. Because now, he understood that the greatest victory wasn't taking first place in a competition, but helping those who had been misjudged learn to believe in their own worth. Remember, talent has no color, no status, no background. Talent only needs a determined heart and someone brave enough not to give up. And sometimes, one act of courage you take today can change your life and the lives of others.